We'll probably go into it a little bit tonight, and then we would go to engage the end chapter and consider alternatives and struggles. I mean, they begin with Greece at the end. Of course, the Syriza debacle, and I'm looking forward to going into that. But they use a word. They use a word that I'm working on myself. Convergences later. So I and myself and Josh are working in collaboration with Bruno Gulli on convergence philosophy. So maybe we'll have a lot to say about that too. So anyway, and also I want to talk about the three C's and 3D capital. Tonight we'll talk about that as well. How this is being pulled off and why, in some ways we should be very careful about how much we think about. I mean, I know we're in the decline of the empire's values. I know how symptomatic we're living and what times we're living through. At the same time, don't be fooled sometimes, or as our friend Aronowitz used to say, not so fast, with everything that's going on around us in a sense, in terms of taking it up as something that is really making a major dent at this point. But we can talk about that, etc. So the section for tonight, and I don't know if anybody has any thoughts from the last week or two on the reading here. I find, again, this book to be extremely rich in terms of its both its historical analysis, the way it metaphorically opens up many territories, new phrases. One great phrase is endo-colonization. Maybe that's a good place to begin, something that we don't really hear in the academy so much, that the empire is really expert at endo-colonialization as well. And that's we'll talk about this in terms of the Cold War as part of the Central American history written between the two world wars and after the end of World War II. And also, this whole notion of military Keynesianism. And I will suggest, for those of you interested in globalization and these things, that Arrighi's book, Giovanni Arrighi's book, Adam Smith in Beijing, is really worth reading, as is The Long 20th Century. He's a very good, narratologist, if you will. He tells a story very well, and is very educated and very, very good at putting things into a broader perspective. So I recommend that very much. He was the one who wrote the piece called Hegemony Unraveling many years ago, which Sam Gindin and Leo Panitch replied to in The Making of Global Capitalism. So it was Arrighi, Gindin, and Panitch, and then, of course, Empire of Negre and Hart, which were the three major books that kind of opened the 21st century, at least theoretically, in a new way. This, of course, is a continuation of thought or thinking otherwise outside the box completely. So anyway, I'd like to go. I mean, first of all, any reactions to the reading and thoughts? I mean, I've been rereading some of Wiener. I won't bore you. He's a very complex writer, but this is the introduction to cybernetics on command and communications, which was the classic text written, and then which was followed by the human use of human beings lectures he gave at Harvard. And this is really a classic in terms of cybernetics as control, as new form of social control and how it operates. And he has many points here. I mean, the introduction is certainly accessible. The rest has a lot of mathematical equations that I don't think any of us really want to wade through, but how he operates. But the crucial sections are Gestalt and universals, how Gestalt shaping is taking place, and then how it becomes part of a universal grammar that's used by state media and as a form of control. And then there's a whole section on cybernetics. David, you may be interested in this. The last chapter is on cybernetics, or second to last chapter, cybernetics and psychopathology. And this is what QB and others did in terms of the psychoanalytic research alongside this group, back in the day. So I certainly recommend this as a background. Again, it's not written as poetically as Deleuze and Guattari, or as flashy, if you will, as a good experimental writing, but it is part of the program, and a very central part of the program. And of course he has the, we'll talk about this, the relationships of command and communication, and what they call, C3-1 in this book, which is command, control, and communication. The genius of the Cold War, they call it in this chapter. So if you had a chance to read it, this is a very fascinating chapter, just for the reasons of uncovering how these things were framed, formed, and done, in many ways. So maybe I can go, first of all, to talk about the history of the Cold War, how this operates for them. He uses Lazzarato. This is Lazzarato probably speaking rather than Alliez, that the United States, is not really thinking about in nuclear warfare balance of powers, but really the balance of terror. And that's probably a good way of looking at things. And this is a term that was phrased by Arrighi, the balance of terror in post World War II thinking, et cetera. So let me go back to the beginning here. So this begins the strategy games of the Cold War, and I want to point out that philosophically, for Wiener and for most people that get into algorithmic governmentality too, are the patron philosopher, if you will, or the patron saint is Leibniz, right? Definitely Leibniz. This is it's not Pascal, it's not Descartes, and very little has been done on Leibniz to deconstruct him. Deleuze, of the people we read actively, Deleuze wrote a book called The Fold on Leibniz, and actually tried to associate him with Giuseppe Verdi's work, which is kind of very imaginative. I don't really remember how he does it, but Deleuze's wife was a pretty well-known French mathematician, so he had probably those discussions occasionally at dinner. But anyway, Leibniz is the author of the principle of sufficient reason, of which, if you're interested in this, and a very good deconstruction of Leibniz, and it's really forgotten, is Heidegger's book on the principle of reason. He undoes many of the notions of the principle. Yeah, see, Steve Knight has The Fold here. Yes, right.
I'm actually holding up Chris's copy.
Yes, yeah. Steve, I know you didn't buy it. You didn't have to tell me that. Yeah. Anyway, so but going back to this patron saint Leibniz is very, very important. In the philosophical community in the United States, the best Leibniz scholar is Nicholas Rescher, who was at the University of Pittsburgh. Very, very first-rate Leibnizian scholar, not overtly political, etc. But and then Yvonne Belenval in France is another one, and Francis what's his name, Dragonnet in France as well. So anyway, but Heidegger does undo this, and also it has been shown that the Leibnizian moment of sufficient reason is basically the architecture, the underlying architecture for life insurance annuities and insurance actuarial tables. So this is kind of interesting too, that the mathematics is already there in this.
What is the principle, Michael? Explain a little bit the principle you're talking about.
Well, this is the beginning of the birth of the differential calculus. This is where Leibniz is really going here. That's what sufficient reason is. I mean, ultimately you have enough, yeah, each equation is justifying the one before it. And, he has these very elaborate systems. This is in his universal grammar. Leibniz is the first of the modern philosophers after Descartes to come up with an attempt to build the universal grammar, this quest for universals. Why Wiener says we're really looking for universals all the time. This is it. And why it becomes a simple one-on-one binary system. He actually goes through this. And again, I'm sorry because we didn't read it, so it's really unfair. But I'm fascinated by stuff like this. To put it mildly. He talks about that the computing machine should always be numerical. As in an ordinary adding machine. The inventor of the adding machine, as you know, is Pascal, right? So we're going back to these 17th century principles of reason, right? Or, rather than on a basics of measurement, as in the differential analyzer of Bush, Van der Waal Bush. So anyway, listen, I'm just throwing these things out because it's important that we look at this cybernetic control and how it's operating and what they're trying to do with it, in terms of the story. And they have a very good. I want to begin again with this page on page. Let me get some light here. 228, and the sentence begins. The paragraph begins. The principle of existence of the Cold War was only definitively damaged by the collapse of the USSR, which crowned the centralization of the global military, industrial, scientific resources in the sole hands of the US, right? Okay. The history of the Cold War is an American history written from start to finish by the superpower that emerged victorious from the two world wars. Overfed by full employment and the technological innovation of the war economy that increased productivity and mass consumption with a logistic militarization of society as a whole. And he calls this, and they have very good terms for this, military subsumption. The United States was confirmed as a creditor power. Of course, the Marshall Plan and forward, but still, right, of the new global order resulting from the socialization and the capitalization of total war. It took the form of an imperialism so deterritorialized, and this is very interesting to me, if we really think about this. It took the form of an imperialism so deterritorialized that it can even be called anti-imperialist. Everybody still uses this language of imperialism, but they're going to really try to go around this. There's the deterritorialization, right? In the sense that it accelerated the disintegration of classic imperialism. All right. There is the deterritorialization of expansion, which is no longer territorial, and the deterritorialization of war that supports neocolonial decolonization. Neocolonial decolonization, and the geopolitics of economic aid. One and the other come from the investment of excess capital in the global protection of the Pax Americana market. And I think, again, they're really on to something here, reading financialization, military Keynesianism, empire, all in these kind of terms. But the Cold War was not only deterritorialization of interstate war aimed at Soviet imperialism, and we could say today Chinese, upsurge, and communist slavery, terms that were used. It was at home and abroad a new, and this is important, a biopolitical regime of endocolonialization, which is a new term they introduced at this point, for the entire population that becomes subject to the American way of life that must be decidedly inscribed at the heart of the war machine of capital. To summarize with Kissinger, what is called globalization is really another name for the dominant role of the United States. So the historical fate, and I want to go back to this just to get your thoughts and, and really open a dialogue about this, because I think this is rich in terms of a new way of maybe thinking about where we are. The historical fate of class struggle will therefore play out in the United States, economically and politically strengthened by the full employment of the Second Industrial War. The working class was nonetheless defeated at the point of contact between the working subject and a new political fundamentalism that readjusted the rules of the economic war by attacking the very idea of communism carried by the Russian Revolution. Even Marx and Lenin, who were called on in Detroit during the 1946 strikes, could not counter this result, and it represented a first victory of the Cold War and the immediate post-war period. But it was also the cycle of struggles for which 68 was the global number and which started in the late 50s in the USA, sounding the death knell of the political strength of class. Confronted by capital labor directly with the development of mass consumption against the managerial institutionalization of general intellect, there were struggles of the internally colonized, blacks, women, proletarians not protected by the enterprise system, students, and new subjectivities. These struggles, without a central contradiction, again, or general mediation, were the first to explore the reality of a new anti-capitalist war machine of which the modalities were, in all evidence, no longer determined in a confrontation between movement and organization that ran throughout the 60s. So maybe we can begin there, because what they seem to see is to try to think outside the old box of thinking imperialism, thinking only in terms of, this kind of orthodox view of class struggle, right? This new term called endo-colonialism. And of course, to look at this, in terms of, globalization is really, U.S. hegemony. I mean, this is really what's going on in many ways. So it's ridiculous to call Russian, special military operations, imperialist or expansionist at this point, right? It's really, the only expansionist thing. But what they're really saying here is they don't really need to, it's not territorial as such, right? They're looking at different kinds of levels of abstraction that proceed by this deterritorialization. So, I mean, anybody want to say anything about this? This is really, I think, a kind of crucial thing. And that 46 Marx, by the way, some of you probably have read C. Wright Mills's New Men of Labor, where he talks about the failure of labor leadership. Labor had the upper hand in some ways. It could have been very powerful post-World War II, but it blew it. That was the end. You had the NLRB in 35, they act that defeated labor, and then again in 46 by the leadership that completely failed to take it up, that became fully compromised. So yeah. Anybody? Yeah.
I just, reading this, one of the things, I mean, just this passage you started with, it sounded to me, to me it was reminiscent of, I joined a little late, but you were talking about Sam Ginn and Leo Panich, their book, and, but the argument that they've been making for a long time, which is that, the U.S. was, rather than territorialization, marking off space, the U.S. was very much built on a model of inclusion. It was sort of bringing countries into this network and this system that provided a context for the national bourgeoisie to seek a certain form of development. And so it seemed to me like I didn't, maybe I'm missing what they're getting at, but it also seemed to me somewhat reminiscent of the arguments in Empire, which again, there's not like this, although, where I think Hart, Negre, and Gindin and Panich really differ is the centrality the latter accord to the capitalist state. I mean, they see it as a very sort of state-centric, administered through the U.S. state. But so I think there are differences, but it does seem that's how I read it. That part of it is, it seemed very resonant with that approach to me. But there may be things.
No, it's interesting. If I could rip on that, I think you're pointing out something. Yes, the Hart and Negri and the notion of empire, to start thinking in terms of empire rather than the older language of imperialism, of which, Hart and Negre were criticized very actively. Helen Niskin Woods at the Left Forum I mean, she was like a pit bull on Michael Hart, when he presented some of his stuff back in I think it was 2006. And then of course Ginden and Banish. And I think what they're bringing to the table here is the war machine, right? They're showing how integral this is, that you need this warfare state.
Exactly, and that's the weakness of Leo and Sam's work,
Yeah,
I think.
I agree.
There's no like, it's like they talk about, the post-World War II period, and it's like the military doesn't exist. It's
Right.
like all this kind of administrative apparatus. It's very much built around foreign direct investment, open markets, those types of things. It's much more, yeah, no, I agree. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yes, Beryl, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this really resonates with me because, we're a client state of
Right.
the United States.
Right.
And currently, we are really kind of experiencing an intensification. And they talk, we've signed this AUKUS pact, which is, the old white boys, UK, America, Australia.
Mhm.
And we're going to get nuclear submarines, which we actually don't need. But except for being they've got this term interoperability, that, Australian military forces have to be interoperable with our allies, the United States. We've had this deluge of, apart from Pelosi going to Taiwan, which we won't speak of, we've had some other people coming to the Solomon Islands to commemorate Guadalcanal and the importance of this in the Second World War. There's this extraordinary evocation of the Second World War and what that means for now. Militarization is very real and very apparent if you're sitting on the outskirts of empire. I don't know what it's like in the center.
We worry about subway violence and things. And
we're permanently militarized.
But it has nothing, and you see this if you go to Greece and you study the Aegean, et cetera, where the fleets are, right? Why the Greeks got the Sixth Fleet and Turkey got the money, right? So, we begin to, really see this in a very different light when you're looking at it, and such as you do in terms of, one of the as you call it, client states, as is Canada, of course.
Of course.
Right? Yeah. So it's, the four Anglo moments, and again, very, very important to keep that in mind. I like this term because, as mostly in the academic world, the term post-colonialism is so operative, but they're basically taking this on and saying, this is a bunch of, BS, right? Why are we talking post-colonial? Right? Why post at all? This is endo-colonization, a new term and a new way of colonizing, this neo-colonial thing that does take place without really occupation in some way, in a very subtle way, in a different way. And again, this fits in, and I think I mentioned this, I think it was Robbie Mueller, a German actor who worked with Wim Wenders in Kings of the Road. And Mueller got the part. He was translating Lacan from French to German, and he was going mad. So Wenders says, well, come be in my film. But anyway, there's a great line of his, the Yanks have colonized our subconscious. Yeah. And this is kind of interesting too, the way the linguistic capital begins to play out at every stage of the way, right? Even for those of us have critical force, we're still subjected to that linguistic capital. And this is very important too. And again, I'll mention another Italian. I'm very fond of the 70s Italian Marxists. They made, I think, major contributions. Ferruccio Rossi Lundi. He wrote a book on semiotics and labor process. Yeah, really wonderful book. Yeah, I have it in Brooklyn. I'll show it when I get back there. It's a wonderful text. Wonderful text.
Michael, this is a question to you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. But I like this as a starting point because I think it gives us a different way, and all of us can relate to the turn of the century produced empire, Ginden, and Panich's making of global capitalism, or their work, and of course Arrighi's work on Adam Smith in Beijing, Hegemony Unraveling, and then of course you have Sami Amin's, periphery and core. These are the major theoretical investitures around globalization and the making of where we are. But please, yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Oh yeah, just one thing. Leo Panich did not like Arrighi's work.
No, I know that. Yeah.
So, but I don't know anything about post-colonial theory, so I'm talking in utter naivete. But there is a transformation that can also be viewed, I would think, from the side of the struggles of social movements, of subjectivities in the former colonized regions, right? That seems like it opens up a different kind of understanding that's more rooted in struggle and contradiction and conflict, right? And even within the colonized countries, as they emerge from that system, there are very different tendencies and aspirations, right, that are being played. I mean, it's a complicated thing. So it does seem to me like something shifts, and that, again, knowing nothing about post-colonial theory, please, people who know something about it, I'd love to hear the interpretation of it. But it always just seemed to me, the little I know about it, is that it was an attempt to kind of recognize that new type of subjectivity that had emerged.
Yeah, they use Nembe, the Thanatopoulos, and the critique of Black reason as one of their foils in this book. I mean, Nembe is really worth reading. He's an incredibly intelligent man and all of that. What they say Nembe lacks, in this kind of post-colonialism or this critique of the colonized subject. And of course, the classic book is Albert Memmi, the Tunisian author, The Colonizer and the Colonized, right? This is the opening book, and then of course Fanon, right? And Fanon and Memmi have an argument with the negritude movements, with César and Senghor to a degree. So this is all building up towards this. But their critique of Nembe is he doesn't have revolution in mind. He's forgotten the horizon. And these are revolutionists, right? To me, this is, again, Lazzarato and Alliez want to keep the horizon of revolutionary alive. It's not enough becoming revolutionary. You have to always think revolution as the horizon, in some ways. So this is where they always are. If you want to think of this as, the future, a futural ecstasies, to put it in, Heideggerian temporality, or to put it in, other kinds of things, the future is always the revolution, right? So the revolutionary subjectivities are being formed, but without the notion of revolution. This is kind of the interesting part that they seem to be going with. It's not enough just becoming revolutionary, right? In this way. So I don't know if that makes sense, but they're trying to look at this. It's like when Sartre said, Marxism is the ultimate horizon of our time. We must think within that, but we must think beyond it too. He's, the presupposition that there is this revolutionary horizon. So they have this critique of Nembe. I think we went over it a little bit last week, that is also part of, as a representative of, or one of the leading lights, if you will, of a kind of, new way of looking at colonization. So, and again, this goes back to, and let me see if I can just make the links to the pages here, because again, it's important. I'll find it, but yeah, bear with me. But he goes through Nembe's son of Polos in this way too. Where he talks about this. I think it's in the chapter before on the before the total wars, in terms of the colonial wars. He goes on. So, to read this book again, you have to continually engage, if you will, in this kind of analogical, where they talked about something earlier about, all of this, and, the critique of Foucault, and then getting up to Nembe, and what he forgets is the revolutionary, or at least revolution in general, right? So this is important. Yeah. So I don't know if anybody else wants to, to add to this. We did the warfare and the welfare. The total wars is that we must, this is what we're living. Basically, this new notion of warfare is hybrid warfare. We're just not at war with China and Russia. We're at war wherever, this American way of life is threatened, right? In many ways, those of you that have seen, I use this movie scene again in The Man Who Fell to Earth. There's a wonderful sequence. Not wonderful, but it's scary. We don't want the, the state is speaking. We're not the mafia. Make it look clean when they're going to kill Buck Henry, who's the accountant for Thomas Jerome Newton, who has 10 patents and has put together all this capital. So that we do not want the socioeconomic balance of the United States upset. Now, that socioeconomic balance is representative of only about the 35–40% people who have pension funds, who are subject to, capital flows and recapital flows, and does not take into account the contingency. But the contingency is being controlled. This is another thing that they see, in terms of class struggle, that's really being forgotten. What do the unions do? The biggest group of agents out here is the precariat now. Nobody has a safe job, really, to say. A few people do, but most people don't. But the unions are not going for part-time workers or for the precariat. They're not trying to mobilize this. They have funds. They're more interested in protecting the self-interest of the top. It's a very old formula that goes back, way back in the day. And it becomes this kind of, what I would call the security principle. That's no security at all, ultimately, right? It's a security, it's an economic security principle that ultimately leads to no security at all, right? For the population. So this is another thing that becomes part of the irony. So anyway, so they're going to begin here because they see as part of this deterritorialization, of course, is the cybernetic warfare, right? And this is very, very, very important to look at this. Maybe we can go on to that and we can come back and forth. So the Cold War cybernetics, which is the second section, 10.1, not only marked the entrance into the cyborg age of cybernetic communication. I think Turing machine, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 1936 is when the Turing machine is invented, right? The computing machine, etc. And, of cybernetic communication and control. It was itself a matter of cyborg in the sense in its gray zone harbored the great transformation of the war machine of capital through feedback. And this is again important of all the information of industrial and scientific and organized total war, becoming the model for the development of the economy of, quote, in parentheses, non-peace, an economy of peace, peacetime, right? From the studies on ways to fire anti-aircraft guns and their automation leading to the idea of feedback and servo mechanisms to the digital simulations needed to build the atomic bomb, cybernetic thought was not only born of war, it continued war by all means in the management of a virtual, real planetary war, allowing a permanent mobilization of all societies submitted to calculations of optimization in good American to get the numbers out, right? They use this, all right? It's great. No science fiction here, since the automatic factory with a computer that calculates the best strategy to win atomic war was the other entity of the cybernetic scenario. This constitutive relationship between the machine to make war and the machine to produce gives cybernetics its most modern meaning based on the Greek word kubernetica, kubernetica, of machine to govern and capitalist machination of the government of people. It governs the management of war and the industrial management of society as a whole, even the systems, and Beth is out of the room, of public health, urban development, organization of domestic space, and more, by which one thinks to understand and control the dynamic by means of new instruments derived from the formalized sciences of engineers and management techniques understood in the broadest logistical sense, that there is no longer a real difference between technique and logistics, right? Hardware and management. The war machine of capital is the engine of this science of organization and of operational research, tending to abolish the disciplinary frontiers by producing hybrids between pure mathematics, which are fundamentalized, hard science with its monumental facilities that can only be shared, birth of big science, engineering, and the social sciences under the auspices of behavioral sciences, and cognitive psychology, behaviorism. Yeah. I mean, I guess today, David, I think the two dominant strains are CBT and DBT, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. Yeah, it sounds like pesticides, right? Yeah, right.
Just step away from
Yeah,
DDT.
right. I'm sorry. I mean, yeah. Keep the insects down, right? Yeah, okay. Presented by the war of applied sciences that had just been won, the engineering of complexity passes between sciences of nature and society with the invention of polymorphic tools built on mathematics, logics, and computers, and their modal and highly formalized approaches had names like operational research, general systems theory. This is all stuff that goes on in many of these training programs. And I have this friend of mine, he's not here, unfortunately. He could add something to the discussion, but he said he didn't read it and he didn't want to be here if he hadn't read the material. But he's ex-military, and he talks about the training, and then how many people go in the military to get skills. This is really what they're going to, and then they may go back to university in the end, but highly skilled people. This is going on all the time. General systems theory. And by the way, those of you, again, I study the Wall, especially the equity markets in Wall Street. Mercer and Simons of Renaissance technology both come out of the Army, out of operational research. This is the Renaissance technologies that put Trump in power. This is Cambridge Analytica, financed by Robert Mercer, whose yacht is out there in the middle, that they can't be touched. They're outside of, the waters. So it's very interesting how this works in our society in many ways. Sequential analysis, mathematics of decision-making, game theory, et cetera. All these things, again, that at least in my estimation, in the 60s and the 70s, there were some people that really studied this on the left. Today, we have very few people that are doing this. They mention it, right? But it's not really studied. We don't have the capability to ask questions of the level that Carl asks, right? Break this all down in an instant for us so that we can understand it. This kind of science for the people, science and popular culture. We don't really have that anymore in many ways. So a first form of transdisciplinary ensued. And this is interesting because we use this term in academia, but this was beginning in terms of the war machine, right? Between logicians, mathematicians, statisticians, physicians, chemists, engineers, economists, sociologists, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have to go through the game theorists, operational, right? Coming directly all from the military. This is interesting. That was favored and financed by the American military. Of course, think tanks like the Rand Corporation, which we know, we've seen their papers. Listen, if these papers are public, they're so out of date. Everybody talks about the Rand program in Ukraine, completely revised by this point, in a sense, right? Rightly considered to be the institutional keystone of the Cold War in the United States. Summer studies, universities, not the Kassos summer program in Greece, but anyway, universities in constant combination with major companies that it is contracted to orient their development, economy of and innovation. And you have to always write, if you're going to write a grant, that's the crucial word, innovate. right? We're innovative, yeah. We're entrepreneurial, etc. Right? It was therefore an entrepreneurial, transdisciplinary, right? Where researchers, albeit directly funded by the military apparatus, were led to arrange networks of technology, finances, and administrators to achieve these projects. A new mode of transversal governmentality. And this is interesting too, because we all think in correspondence, or we think correlatively, we think in these kind of terms, but they're looking at a transversality. And by the way, Felix Guattari wrote a very good piece on transversality in his book Molecular Revolution, right? For all society also ensued one that had scientific production communicate with the science of production in the factory, while machining citizen consumers according to the same procedural principle of optimization of control for regulation of an open system, taking into account the factor of uncertainty and of the extension of the domain of circulation of information. As a result, on this dual level, which involves, and this is going back to Marx, and I really like this about them, of the general intellect of capital, imposing cybernetic as the metaphysics, as the theory of everything, no longer just the general, but cybernetics as the theory of everything. Andy Pickering, informed by the Cold War, led to an experimentation on the planetary scale and a global epistemology of the Soviet enemy based on simulation, right? But that is not all, right? It was the more intensive strategy for rational continuation of total war, defined by the inseparability of the total domestic product between the military and civilian domains, and by its incompatibility with every kind of laissez-faire. This is interesting, how everybody claims on the right, we love laissez-faire, but they will never practice this. They're the biggest, excuse my language, fucking regulators out there, really, in a way. Yeah, what did the Reagan administration really do? It created more and more regulating agencies, many, even though it deregulated, quote, stuff, they created new regulations within that, which means that the Cold War is an American project of globalized social control, not just of this population, driven by a cybernetics of the population.
Michael,
So the cyber war is very important. Yes, Carl, yeah, I'm waiting.
This is just kind of riffing a little bit, but
Yeah,
it was interesting reading this. Like, it made, that, like, part of maybe the project you're talking about would be, rethinking kind of the history of modern mathematics and the formalizations that began to take place in the late 19th century, with number theory, the theory of real net. There was this whole series of very important developments that took place, and and then the way that it's been appropriated, because I think we should distinguish between kind of mathematics as sort of a technology and a technology of thought from the way it's kind of appropriated by capital. And it just made me think of Badiou. And he's written this book that I haven't read, but I really want to read, where he talks about numbers and mathematics from a theoretical point of view.
Two books, if I could just say, two books. One is on the concept.
In the end, number and numbers.
Yeah. One is on the concept of number. The other book is
right. There's two.
And I would read the book in praise of mathematics before reading concept of number. I think you're going to have a better understanding of what he's doing. Yeah. For Badiou, it's the mathematical ontology, right? That is really
exactly. So there's another way of thinking about all this that's very, at least so. And in the end, he sort of talks about reclaiming mathematics from capital. That's sort of one of his projects. So it's just sort of a supplemental point, but that I think people sometimes conflate mathematics with a certain kind of instrumental control, and I think that that's not right. Is what
No, I agree with you.
It can be used that way very easily.
Yeah.
But it's not. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. In many ways, yes, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is a 19th century. Again, by the way, I mentioned Hacking last time, The Taming of Chance. His best book, in my opinion, is The Emergence of Probability, a study of the 17th century mathematics. Yeah. Ian Hacking, the philosopher, yeah, is an excellent book on probability theory. And remember that Descartes is writing in the beginning of Manufacturing Capital, right? Certainty has a role for the capitalist, right? In terms of this really works out very nicely, the Cartesian project, with the transition from mercantile to manufacturing capital. It's very interesting when you begin to think of it this way, and you start seeing this history of mathematics alongside the developments in, the manufacturing revolution, the industrial revolution, and different forms of capital, how it is coinciding in a way, and what you're talking about, Carl, how it does become instrumentalized or applied mathematics rather than the pure or mathematics as a very different kind of discipline that, that goes.
The emergence of probability, the reemergence, that's an interesting story because it's become very, very important in terms of a lot of applications today that it didn't have in the period they're writing about, in the immediate Cold War period, which was much more about kind of, this engineering technology, optimization, kind of determined systems that were in some sense closed. And probability sort of has the idea of there's, contingency, there's aleatory process. And it's interesting why that's become more.
Yeah, well, you also see this in the sports world, right? Sabermetrics in baseball. You see it in, the managerial, moments in, especially sports like baseball. And of course, you see the applicability of mathematics and science in almost everything that has to do with sports now. We speak about this. We speak about the angles of pro football player, when he reaches for a ball out of bounds, whether it was the physics of that. So this is permeated almost into everyday life. And sabermetrics is very much based on, Wall Street's, quantitative methods, right? These are coinciding. Moneyball, Billy Bean at Oakland is coinciding very much with, with certain models that are used on Wall Street to determine, what equities will be on the list to go up, which will go down, how markets will turn, technical chart patterns, all these things, waves, and so this is a very, very rich field that has been very unexplored again. I mentioned Dirk Struick. He's very accessible. Excuse me. The short and concise history of mathematics. It's a very good book. A Marxist mathematician who ended up at MIT. He taught until he was 103. I thought I told you that, right? He was a great walker, Dirk Struick. And he wrote a book on whaling in New England too, as well. Yeah.
Michael, just in passing, who was the other person you mentioned earlier who wrote about
Hacking? Hacking. Hacking. Ian, E-I-A-M. Yeah. Taming of Chance and the Emergence of Probability. And another very good book of his was What Does Language Matter to Philosophy? Yeah. So he's very, very thoughtful person. He's kind of I call him an accessible Foucault. He's easier to read than Foucault, but has similar kind of objects in mind, right? Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll take this up, Michael. Maybe you.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah. So anyway, let's go on. So the cybernetics of the brain. So this is very interesting how this is going alongside the military buildup, right? That the military really, in a way, is this new cybernetic warfare, right? And in a sense. And I mean, look, some of us grew up, I used to play pinball machines. You could make money playing pinball machines, back in the day, in New Orleans, they had payoffs. You go to these bars and, if you ran up enough points on the things, you go to the cash machine with a point to the bartender, and you'd get the money back from it. But this was hand-eye coordination, and it was part of a kind of control mechanism when you really think about it. It's a game theory at work. How much can it calculate, etc. Yeah, I mean, and how much can you master it in a sense? So it becomes part of this cybernetic thing. Okay, the internal production, the interior that proves the capability for global projection was the power that emerged victorious from the war. This was the main benefit from the war at such unequal levels in the military, industrial, technological, financial, and other domains that it marked the end of European supremacy, even though we still take ideas from Europe, right? And its classically expansive forms of imperialism. The pre-war war was in ruins, while the wave of decolonization spreading across Europe at its time of social property, its collaboration, contributed to the new forms that the global function of American power had to take at home. This power had to face the questions of demobilization and economic conversion, as well as the labor power resulting from the full employment of war. Coinciding with the emergence of the questions of blacks and minorities, racial wars of internal decolonization, and with the problem of the place of women in society after their massive presence in factory, war of the sexes for equal wages threatening to affect the domestic economy, the increase in strikes acutely posed the question of the transduction of warfare into an anti-communist welfare. Right? Very interesting, right? Anti-communist welfare. To carry out the conversion of the destructive forces mobilized by the sciences and industries of death into the productive forces of the American way of life, the welfare of mass consumption, rolling out the virtuous circle of wealth and power, welfare had to integrate the subjective conversion of the population, militarized and socialized by the experience of total war, into individualist workers supposed to lead the egoistic maximization of Homo economicus to the point of optimal tendency for the systems between consumers and producers. The question of social production and the work of reproduction of the workers takes its place at the heart of the new cybernetic strategies of the war machine of capital. More investment than ever had to be made in the family unit, very important, and the feminine condition. These are phrases used during the period. It was not for nothing that they were the subject of the famous, quote, kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev in '59. Interesting, huh? It took place in Moscow during an international fair where the American pavilion consisted of a model home of 6 fully furnished rooms over which a particularly feminine housewife was to reign. The war of missiles, the missile gap, was joined by a gendered war of merchandise. Very interesting, right? You can think of Bernays here, and I don't know if he was still alive, but this was something that would come out of his mind, right? So what do they call it? Not the missile gap or the generation gap or whatever, but the commodity gap, right? Yeah, great phrase. Emphasized by Nixon's rhetoric, to us, diversify, the right to choose is the most impressive thing, right? We don't have one decision made at the top by one government official. We have many different manufacturers and many different kinds of working washing machines so that the housewives have a choice. It's like I went to the pharmacy. I counted on the one thing at the pharmacy here in Montreal. There are literally 31 brands of toothpaste.
Yep.
All with the same ingredients, right? 31. One long aisle from Sensodyne, Crest, Colgate, all kinds of things, and then multiple within each manufacturer. Would it not be better, right, if the housewives have a choice? Would not it be better to compete in the relative merits of washing machines than in the strengths of rockets, right? And this is Nixon speaking, right? We have the commodity gap, not the missile gap, right? Interesting, right? The theory of rational choice, and this is interesting, and Carl, you should know this, rational choice is part of the analytical Marxist school. They understand this very well. thus passes through consumption, which is no longer the frontier for future peace and prosperity, but the lines of the present design designated on the domestic front of the Cold War peace by the white line of electronic appliances, right? Yeah, from the Hoover vacuum, right? From the Hoover Dam of the New Deal to the Hoover vacuum in the 50s, right? Yep. The TVA, right? All the way through, right? To this, right? So the importance of communication was to be defined in the fact that this characteristically American project had to be sold, according to the bestseller published in 49 by a professor of philosophy at Harvard, Ralph Barton Perry. And this is interesting. This is where the university still plays a role, despite its complete descent into, idiocy, right? But here you go, 49, Ralph Barton Perry, as an enterprise consolidating, started with a couple, an aggregate of spontaneities in a collective individualism, two expressions, right, of the same, of which the truth is a scientific humanism equated with the social engineering of freedom itself. It's amazing, right? When you really think about this, how brainwashing, how effective, and how deep it really is, right? Of freedom itself. Lyman Bryson, in another successful academic work published 2 years prior with the sober title Science and Freedom, which is where we are today with COVID, to follow the science. Think of this nonsense, this kind of these words, right, that are these cliches that are coming down. The arms race that allows the Keynesianism of war against the USSR reconfigured welfare into a war of communication. So the welfare state is reframed in terms of the cyber state. Yeah, very interesting, right? I think, right? Contributing in turn to positing intellect as, and here you go, Carl, as an instrument of national purpose, a component part of the military industrial complex, the power of which was also measured by the quality of its Washington machines, right? Right? It's great, right? I mean, in a way. I mean, not only are they having fun, they're very accurate in describing this. I mean, you're really reading a history of objects in a very enlightened form that's extremely political and enlightening, all in 3 or 4 paragraphs. So again, I mean, I don't want to, go over the top with this book, but anyway, it's an important lesson and an important way of doing things. So, and this is very interesting, coming up to Gary Becker at the University of Chicago in the 70s, human capital. The source of the development of human capital was the integration, and this is very important, of civil and military resources in a scientific, academic, military industrial complex, projecting science to the level of an endless frontier, right? According to the manifesto title of Vannevar Bush's report in 65, good friend of Norbert Wiener, by the way, the MIT group of the 40s, post-World War II, 1945, Science, the Endless Frontier. This theme was quickly taken up by then General Eisenhower in a memorandum of 46. I won't read the whole thing here because I'm not sure we need to read that. Military, civilian, and civilian military permanent technological war could only favor a global and systematic approach, integrating the new technologies, the management of the social in the software of public welfare. Interesting, huh? Nice phrase, the software of public, commanded by a state that was less administrative than pre-ministrative. Yeah, this is good, pro-administrative, excuse me. The pro-administrative state, to use Brian Barlow's thing. Yeah. So instead of the administered world, this would be a great essay of Adorno and Horkheimer, and especially Adorno, who contributed a lot to this. Maybe the pro-ministered world is a very important new kind of concept. Not to something, but for the ministration of it, right? And this fits very well in my mind with the priestly class. The technique, the manipulation that Nietzsche really understood extremely well. Nietzsche was phenomenal in understanding how to propagandize and also to undo it together. Really interesting in this respect. Okay, so the systemic, excuse me, of the Cold War, and systematic, we could add, of course, that commanded its C3-1 rationality, the three C's: command, control, and communication, and of course, information, involving the fission of the social atom, was the invention of a strange gray zone that is neither peace nor completely war. And this is very interesting too. This is where we live. You know, no accident that Blumenthal and Norton named their program the gray zone. Yeah, in many ways. I don't know if you know the gray zone. Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton started it, and then Aaron Matti, Gabor Matti's son, are on it. They do. It's a kind of an expose. Some people have problems with it, but it's interesting. The gray zone, they call it, right? Yeah, in a sense. As the extreme situation where all forms of social subjection start to depend directly on a machinic servitude to the system as such, even as it asserts its immanence in the axiomization of all modes of realization, according to purely functional relationships. Here's your instrumentality, Carl, that make them infinite in right. Or to say it with Deleuze and Guattari, the axiomatic, and this is again very important, the axiomatic is immanent in the sense that it finds in the domains it moves through on so many models, termed models of realization. So this is a very Spinozist way of going about things, where you begin with the axiom and you find these multiple models within that axiom to work with. Yeah, very, very interesting. And also formal axioms in mathematical equations, right? Yeah, very, very important here.
What is
So
the term models of realization? I couldn't quite place that. Like what is?
well, it's a footnote. I mean, I'll go to the.
Application. Are they talking about?
I mean, it's Deleuze and A Thousand Plateaus in the War Machine. I mean, I have the book here, so yeah. Let me just see what they say. Yeah, this is from what we read before you joined us, but we didn't really go through it. Yeah, this is on apparatuses of capture. We didn't read this section, but let me see if I can find the actual the pages in which they engage this. It's in another edition. Oh yeah, axiomatic, which states become models of realization, restores or reinvents, in new and more technical terms, a new system of machinic enslavement. So this is what's going on: new models of realization that result in new forms of machinic enslavement. Right? Yeah. Okay. So for us, there's therefore no tension between the will for axiomatization, characteristic of the Cold War, and the practices first developed with a sense of urgency, the very multiple and much more pragmatic practices that had to be extended, expanded, formalized, and theorized. Here, on the contrary, we reach the axiomatic engine of the transdisciplinary practices implemented in the laboratories of the Cold War, a cold transdisciplinarianism. So I wonder if we should form a warm transdisciplinarianism. Anyway, the war machine of capital would thus be able to develop in the Cold War the imminent axiomatics of a new capitalism. And this to me is an important strategy to look at, right? It takes away from just this evolutionary notion, right? This one of human-machine systems, right? Which imposed a system of generalized enslavement, taking charge of subjection in normalization, modulation, modeling, and information that bear on language, Beryl, in terms of the new inclusive, being policed on languages of exclusion, and they're gonna get her on exclusion. I can already see this, right? And not being inclusive in perception, desire, and movement, and which proceed by way of micro assemblages, going back to these new models of realization. In this sense, and above all, the Cold War was a war of subjectification. This is important. Again, how do we become subjectivated, subjectivized, right? In a sense, bringing with it what has been rightly called a veritable behavioral revolution. This is very important. A veritable behavioral revolution. Yep. And it would be a synonym of unprecedented state intervention, a state deterritorialization that deterritorializes, mediatizes, and axiomatizes the state itself. And this is a very important set of propositions here. Of state deterritorialization that deterritorializes, mediatizes, and axiomatizes the state itself by putting it in a network in the entire socius. This is a term of Deleuze and Guattari that is inclusive of all social relations, through which peace and war are identical in the feedback of the epistemology of the external enemy onto the ontology of the interior enemy, extending the imaginary field of the global proposition of the Cold War. And this could be applied today, what's going on in terms of China and Russia together. I mean, to think about this today. Yeah, besides the obvious propaganda that we all see and we all look at. How is this playing out? The rise of the TV sitcom occupied Americans' living rooms, while the building of the succession of even more reinforced situations rooms occupy the White House. And, the great satire, of course, is the war room in Dr. Strangelove, when George C. Scott goes in. What's the Ruski doing here? What's he doing here? Gets in a fist fight, the general. It's hilarious. And yeah, anyway, right? Occupied the White House basement, the war room, right? Across the newly emerging American behavioral sciences. And again, one has to read, really in a sense, Beryl, of course, I go to the shelf immediately when I hear this stuff about inclusive and exclusive language. I go to verbal behavior of B.F. Skinner. We're really in this kind of, behaviorism 101 at this point. They're just reconstituting this. And of course, Walden too, right? In many ways. It's very interesting. And Skinner, beyond freedom and dignity, becomes the philosopher of the cybernetic moment in many ways, alongside, of course, Wiener and others, in terms of the mathematics and the equations. And Josiah Rice, who nobody reads anymore, was at Harvard too, who educated a lot of these people. So anyway, across the newly emerging American behavioral sciences, sites of Cold War rationality, the situation took root, and its explosion of experts. And, all you have to do is turn on CNN. You've got some drunk general every week, telling you about what's really happening in the Middle East. Hold on a minute, I got to get my Jack Daniels for a second. It was real tough in Fort Benning, Georgia, back in the day. But it reminds me back here, Chris, of this and that. You can hear the discourses, right? And it's explosion of experts. So the whole cult of the expert, right, which is used by so many things, and it also made communicate under a single term, right? That of containment. To communicate is to contain. There you go, Beryl. Your little experience today is filled with insights here to work with. The psychology of the middle classes contain one's emotions, secure one's home, domestic containment, et cetera, and the strategy of curbing, of course, Soviet power, right? The ins and outs of the situation lead back to the prediction made by Warren Weaver, the brains behind operational research, OR, Grandmaster Cyborg, right? There we go. The rappers never did this one, right? And the creator of transdisciplinary research networks. The distinction between the military and the civilian in modern war is a negligible distinction, right? It may be even, for example, the distinction between war and peace has gone by the board. And they're people speaking this, right? And very important to understand this, right? Yeah, very important, right? So I think this 10-1 is very crucial for an understanding of this thing. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Oh, this is a question to everybody, like just how do people see like this, what they're talking about in terms of, the Cold War, the 1950s, etc., and today, because I mean, today we have far more complex and powerful computers, but it's like, do you see it as kind of like a straight continuity, or do you, like, I'm just wondering if other people sort of see what's being done, like what Beryl was talking about, these new control systems, if they represent a different logic to some degree, or I don't really know, but I don't know. It's just
Well,
like,
first of all, I don't think there's one logic at work here, right?
yeah,
There's a multiplicity of logics, right? I mean, it's not just that we're looking at the traditional logic of capital here. We're looking at different types of moments, the axiomatics and these models that they're talking about that are being realized, and this is a very different set of vectors and arrangements and a very different mathematical set of operations, right? That is happening. I mean, I think we spoke about this. Look, you can't get to the world of the derivative without going through M prime. That's very true. You need that accumulation of capital to that degree. At the same time, there is some kind of break, if you will, that happens, Carl. I mean, to maybe frame the question differently, between that M1 cycle that Marx is still talking about, and this, ever expanding derivative, a base culture, in which a lot of the credit system is built upon, as you probably know. I mean, it's a very, complex set of formulas that are always operative, but at the same time, it is created this new, creditor economy that is brought to you again by this vestiges of the Cold War, right? Yeah. So I don't really see it
yeah,
as just a linear progression. That it's just every year this is out. I think what they're doing is they're trying to understand how the fundamentals are set very early on, right? And then how they remorphed and rethought in terms of any situation, right? Yeah, Chris. Yeah, please. Yeah,
mhm.
yeah.
Kind of a simple comment, but sort of thinking
Yeah,
about
sure,
the progression.
Yeah,
The idea of the internet is sort of this almost like crucible of the transdisciplinarity,
right.
and sort of the ultimate cybernetic technology, which sort of that transdisciplinary, especially with all the MIT people and the early researchers with cybernetics, are actually the ones like creating like in the relations between like MIT and like DARPA and all this. So,
right.
And of course, like we see that progressing within these sort of communicationist control loops, and yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, we're 1992 may have been the Stiglerian revolution, if you will. The revolution that makes a Bernard Stiegler possible, in terms of technics and time. The prosthetic called the internet, right? The machine, quote, now man, right? That is happening. So this is very, very, very important to reconsider. Yeah.
Well, Chris, don't you think though, like, I mean, that you could argue again that like there's something in the early technology, and there was a lot of kind of anti-commodification, the idea of free software, open source software. There were some of these moments, in the development of the internet, and it seems like you could also argue that there's something that kind of in the internet is sort of overflowing this kind of centralized, administered cybernetic control, right? This centralized that is, I don't know. It's just like it's not like. Do you know what I'm kind of getting at? That there's like this difference in attention, right?
I totally know what you mean. I think I'm like a little bit biased, just like sort of interacting with the internet at the time I did. It's sort of this like being in a generation like almost like born into it is already this like kind of obvious like social media kind of conditioning mechanism. I sort of, at least from the sources I read about that early history, I've read just like feel like I've thought a lot about how that sort of early utopian, like the techno utopian dream of it, actually is within this sort of like the what was the phrase from a few pages ago, like the scientific engineering of freedom kind of thing. And that's just the stuff I've read. Like I wasn't, of course, like alive for that sort of like early internet phase, so like maybe I can't really understand like the benefits of that like techno utopian ideal and dream, but I don't know, I think there's something there. And like, but when you bring up sort of like decentralization and stuff like Bitcoin or like stuff like that, like this as this new like decentralized technology, like maybe that sort of like decentralization is actually somehow a kind of like centralization. That's not exactly what I mean, but sort of just like wary about the idea of how like that overflow of information is actually this calculated thing that at the time seems decentralized. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be so critical of it either. No, I just think it's like, again, like when like the time I'm born into is like I'm more ripe to be critical towards the internet.
Oh, I share a lot of those sentiments, but I was just thinking, of like somebody like, I don't know if you've ever heard of Richard Stillman, who was like a software designer and he had the notion of like, everyone should be able to use this, everyone should be able to modify it. It's a public good. I mean, they really had kind of like, this is a public good. It's not about appropriation. It's not about intellectual. They were against intellectual property rights, essentially. And so it wasn't like techno-utopianism, I don't think, as much as a different model, a different way of thinking about it, which was kind of present in, as I understand it, a lot of the early people who really kind of grabbed onto the technologies and were having fun designing it. And that's obviously what didn't happen. I mean, that was the road that could have, right, been taken, and instead we got Amazon.
Remember 9/11, 2001 took place 9 years after the internet highway is born. This created a whole new animal, if you will, a whole new machinic, transdisciplinary with multi-directional research. And it's fed conspiracy theories. You have all kinds of moments here, yeah. And I mean, there's a great thing. I mean, why look for conspiracies? Look for the stupidity behind something instead of the conspiracies, right? In a sense. So we have all this stuff going on, but this is being anticipated. I think this is why they're talking about this person, Warren Reaver, of operational research, OR. How does this operate, operational resource? And I recommend a book. I mean, he's not my favorite philosopher, but the book Quest for Certainty by Dewey fits this very much. If you want to read a very good, long essay, it's called The Quest for Certainty by John Dewey about operational research and operational, optimization. This is fitting very much. And alongside this, of course, you have these books that are very high powered coming out of, German, American intellectuals such as Peter Drucker on management, and, of course, and he's going to go back over to the two problems of the United States, Russia abroad and labor at home. That's still the central problem right now. Right? We want to think about it, it's the Russian Federation now and labor at home. But, it's very much in my mind, pretty much under control at some levels. Labor at home is very much under control, despite, and I'm all for Amazon workers and Starbucks and Uber and whoever else wants to organize. The question is, how long does it last and what kind of force is behind it, yes, David, yeah.
What I was going to say, Coral, in terms of, I think, some of the issues you're raising, one of the things that, for lack of a better way of putting it, I think is creeping people out at this moment of the cyber age is the idea that your phone really knows what you've been talking about. So this is a kind of a common phenomenon that technology has gone here, but your phone really can know what you've said. So let's say you've been discussing um, the need to buy underwear. You will get targeted advertising about that. If you've been discussing something else, it's
Mhm.
able to pick up on that and guide this. So, I can think of about 4 or 5 people I know socially who are not really predisposed towards paranoia, but have begun, which I find sad, to, kind of caution their kids about the kind of things they post on social media, particularly if it's political and anti Republican, because they are really afraid of a Republican win coming in 2024 and the idea of where that kind of technology could go in terms of moving from the kind of garden variety seductions of capitalism, saying, well, we know you want to buy that thing. So, you talked about Prada loafers. You're ready to drop $800 on them. So, here you go. To more what it would be
Yeah.
like to feel like really you are heavily policed by the technology you use and where that could go. And I don't really think that they're necessarily far wrong. Where it is a very complex thing to say your privacy can be that encroached on without your knowing it. You're just having a conversation about something. You may not even be aware your phone's on. To say, where could this information go? How is it bundled? How is it sold? What's happened with it? And there is a definite potential for tremendous darkness there, which I think it's creating a not unrealistic anxiety of what the potentials of that are. It's sort of like, in a bit of a leap, if we think of a novel as disturbing as The Handmaid's Tale, when Margaret Atwood was shopping that around, she was in a kind of strong position because she had had a few wins with other books that sold well, so editors were taking this seriously. But many of them really told her, this is way too dark. It's just too dark. Could you lighten it up? And it feels too incredible. But she did show them research that said there's nothing that's happened in this book that has actually not happened. Truly, if you just look at
Very,
various
very
works
right. Yeah,
of
yeah.
totalitarian systems,
Absolutely.
perverse inactions, massive states of theocracies that have created disturbances like this, sexual slaveries, all sorts of things. She really documented it all, and finally, I think it was Random House green-lighted it and said, you're so right, we're so wrong. Don't take a thing out. We're taking a chance on your book, and gave it a massive promotion, which made it a great bestseller. It would deservedly so. It's such a well-written novel, but it does create that eeriness of what we are capable of. And my own take on this is I think that more people who do tend to fall on the liberal side of things, they were aware of McCarthyism. They saw what Roy Cohn was about. They saw all of this. They could see fascistic leanings in the United States. But I do think we're at a moment where people's level of anxiety about what can happen is just much more heightened than ever before in my experience. And Michael, I'd be curious because I would imagine, of course, you don't have to tell us your age, but I would think you came of age in the 50s, a very conservative decade there. You know, having lived through that and then being here in the America of the now, so to speak, does it feel like there is a larger distrust of the government than there was?
Well, I mean, I was more of a child of the 60s, but that's okay. The 50s is when I really liked the rebellion of the 60s. I took to the beats and the jazz, the people of the 50s very much so, and a lot of the work that was done. And, but all to say, yeah, I mean, I recognize in the people that I grew up with and the people that I knew were a pretty sophisticated group and
Uh-huh.
fairly well educated, that they had a very healthy paranoia. They
Mm,
understood what was coming down. They had the aptitude to see through things in
mm,
many ways and could play it, that way. They were rebellious in a certain way. The thing that I find very lacking, and this has been going on, I think, since the beginning of the internet and maybe a little before, I mean, there was still remnants of it in the 80s, is the lack of rebellious spirit, the
mm,
real rebellion, the inability to take risks. That
mhm,
somehow part of the job, I'm not saying everybody in the 60s, 10% of the 60s, maybe really, in a sense, the youth were really willing to take risks, right? And, there were risks taken, of course, with drugs, there was a lot of self-destructive behavior, but at the same time, this ability to rebel, the slogan was more like Mao, you are right to rebel, right? It is a right that you have. This right has really been stolen. Again, somehow it has been conditioned into people that they cannot rebel. They're not supposed to do it. Look at what Beryl's going through at a university, right? That you actually have to, in our generation, they try that stuff. We'd tear up the paper and tell them to go wipe their behinds with it. I mean, we would literally say that, in a sense, right? And we would have people on our side, and they would leave the room embarrassed, right? Or they would leave the room where completely flustered. Today, there's not that mass movement, and it doesn't cross people's minds to do this. To pick up the paper and say, what this is good for, right? Save your money at the supermarket, something like that. So anyway, this is to me the way. I mean, I experience, in my own, experience, So yeah.
It's fear. Everybody's scared.
Well, what's really happened, and a very good book on this too. Again, I'm sorry, I live in that world at times, but trying to cross between the streets, that and everyday life. But The Administration of Fear by Paul Virilio. How fear itself is now part of this administration, right, of everyday life. How it comes. And Escape from Freedom, again, 1941, Fromworth's Escape from Freedom. Virilio follows it up with, the Administration of Fear, and you see this in all kinds of things. And to me, what it's really about, I mean, at least I'm noticing this in students and attitudes that I see around, is this inability to accept freedom as responsibility. That you really, if you're free, you really have a responsibility to be free. And it's something that's earned and not a given, right? And that there's always this constant struggle. But I'll listen to Beth, and then we can go back to my old age, right? The layers of, yeah, anyway.
This strikes a chord with me because a few weeks ago, I watched this excellent Is my mic too high?
It's okay, no.
Oh,
Loud
okay.
and clear.
Thanks. I watched this very well done documentary called The Janes, but it was about these extraordinary young women who, with no training, with no medical training whatsoever, actually started doing abortions and did thousands of them. And what they endeavored and what they risked in the course of this project, simply jumping in and filling, this was right after, or this was obviously during Roe v. Wade in Chicago. It made me very sad because I realized that this grew up in the early 70s out of an oppositional culture, partly out of their disgust at the sexism of the sort of protest movement, which was very male dominated. And they just did this. And, I don't think it could happen now. What would we say? We'd go, oh, well, maybe we could have an NGO, or maybe I should donate to Planned Parenthood. But do you know what it means to do a D&C? That's what they learned to do. A dilation and curettage in someone's home, on someone's bed, and they infected no one. They had no septic abortions. It's absolutely extraordinary. And I was just left very shaken at the feeling that this could not happen now. And partly because of what you said, Michael, about just the security principle and the inability to risk.
Right. Yeah, I just want to say, the severity of what we're living through today is much worse, right, than it was in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. The more terrifying aspect of it is nobody is, up in arms. There's no oppositional culture. There are little hints there and there, but there isn't this rebellion. So you have to ask the question, what has happened to passion? We've asked this question with Stiegler. What has happened to desire? How much has it been deflected, into non-desire? this libidinal exhaustion or this libidinal displacement that is going on, because the fight is really for life itself at this point. It's it's very clear. I mean, the climate change is for real. We come up with a bill, everybody's praising that Joe Biden's got this stupid bill. I mean, the Joe Manchin tax avoidance thing for the oil companies. And, when you really read between the lines, what kind of bill is this? I mean, this is a bill you would have expected back in the 50s, maybe, 75 years ago, in a sense. But everybody's praising it as this progress or something like that. And this is going to be the mediatic thing. And this is going to be, David, when you talk about the friends whose kids on social media are going to be conditioned maybe into becoming Republicans or Democrats, they're going to miss the whole boat because they're not at that level of capacity to think through these things, because there's been a lack, in my opinion, again, and another reason I like Bernard Stiegler so much, this lack of transmission that's going on. There's no longer that lack, this lack of the dialogical space, the space that people actually communicate within. It is command, communication, and control. This is what cybernetics does. It's not really involved in dialogue, right? It's not involved in what you practice, David, for example, in terms of the talking cure. It is not involved this way. It has, these moments. It's very much based on logical positivism, mathematical instrumentality, all of these things. And this is what everybody, they can be wonderful kids, very concerned about the environment. They put out the recyclables every Monday, and, they do their duty and pick up a piece of trash on the street, clean up the dog doo-doo, whatever. They have all the right, quote, political correctnesses, but there's no thinking. This is really the problem. This is the most frightening part, even though there was some craziness and nothing but craziness when I'm growing up in a certain way, or, in a sense, but, where are the Hunter Thompsons today? In a sense, in terms of gonzo journalism, right? Where he just, people are frightened of him when he's going to ask a question. We don't have this. We have parrots in the audience, right? Mr. President, what did the president have to say? Can I get a question in? You know what this is. So it's all this kind of, in a way, it's a kind of almost, to put it in psychoanalytic vocabulary, it's a kind of narcissistic staging of everybody's careers at work, right? That we see in the media. This is what's yeah, go ahead, Carl. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's interesting. I mean, today, if you want to organize an insurrectionary movement, the first thing you think about is creating a Facebook page for it. But
yeah, we can do
which
that.
tells us
Why
a lot
not?
about where we're at. But I was just like when you were riffing, about Hunter Thompson, and like I think that there was a sense. This is also from my parents, because my parents, and when they were the '60s adult generation. And I think there was just a sense that you could take risks and that you weren't going to fall through the bottom. Now, I don't think that was true for all sectors of society. I don't think that was a universal experience, but I think there was a sense that somehow something would catch you on the way down. I think. So it
Well,
was.
I'm not so sure about that. I had three very good friends who committed suicide. So it wasn't all, just rebellion and exteriorization that went on too. This is another thing. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know about
Yeah,
that. Some people didn't
yeah.
have that kind of security. Yes, we didn't have inflation. I had an apartment for $50 a month, back in the day. I know that, I could leave my parents' home at 18. I wanted to leave when I was 14, 15. In fact, I went out and rented an apartment because, in New Orleans, if you're old enough to put the money on the counter, tall enough, they'll take the money and they'll give you the room, the alcohol, the drugs, or anything. There's no,
But just
yeah, yeah. So anyway,
just
yeah.
one point about, like, I have a good friend who's a journalist, and so I've learned a little bit about the field, and it's in some ways worse than academia. So, like, the pay levels have been cut. There's no secure positions, and it's like the whole economy of journalism has been rendered utterly precarious, and it's very hard to figure out, how would you do gonzo journalism? Because gonzo journalism could be sort of your last, great statement, and then you just sort of, it's there is something that is, fear, this, and the sense of containment, that there's not really. I think that there is something that's happened that's objective in terms of how people really experience the world, even though we have all these, goodies in it, but there's something about that,
Well, to me, again, I mean, what they're trying to do here, Alliez and Lazzarato, is they're trying to correlate this with this command, communication, and control, that this is the age of cyberspace. The cyborg is taken over in a way. This is the warfare that's going on and it's just as violent in a certain way as the physical violence. They make distinctions between soft violence and hard violence. They make these distinctions as this book goes on, and in a way, the cyberspace is a soft violence, but it's a very vicious internalized violence that's going on as well. Yeah. In many ways. And, again, it's no accident, and David can speak to this, that, the re-emergence, behaviorism was on its way out in oppositional culture in the 70s, the 60s, nothing but arguments against. Merleau-Ponty spends, 250 pages arguing against behaviorism and the phenomenology of perception and the structure of behavior. This is what he's doing. There are many, many books about this. Sartre, of course, with existential psychoanalysis. Of course, the better practitioners of, traditional Freudian psychoanalysis. So anyway, we don't have that anymore. We don't have that anymore, in so many ways. This is a real issue. How much this has been contained, to go back to Kennan's phrase about containment, which was the major principle of the Truman Doctrine, in 48, this principle of containment brought to you by Princeton, as they brought you, not a lot of other folks, right? This is what's happening. This is contained. Violence has to be contained, right? You think about this. Look at this thing. Beth's aware. I don't know if a lot of you are aware. Josh is aware of it. I think we talked about it, this African group, the Uhuru, the group in St. Louis and in Philadelphia, that is, under siege, right? In a sense, these are people that step up. You want to say something, Beth? Yeah.
No, it was St. Pete, Florida, and not
St.
Philly.
Petersburg, Florida. Yeah. I'm sorry, I was thinking move. The last time.
Yeah, I know. Me too.
Yeah. Anyway, again, this is a containment of these kind of groups that send a message out, and you're right, Carl, in a sense, the risks are, and the consequences are always shown, right, to the public, but they were shown to the generation of the 60s too. It didn't stop a lot of people, right? In a way, yeah. It didn't stop people in a certain way. And I'm not saying this was a glorified moment in things, but they're coming out of a position that it's no longer the Russian Revolution, that is the model here. It's the event, itself that is bringing the revolutionary process. And unless you're thinking horizon of revolution, you're not thinking. This really is an ontology of revolution that's going on, to my mind. Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Yeah. Margaret Kimberly has a very good assessment of this on the Black Agenda report. Yeah. And Ethan, thank you for the Tucker Carlson remarks. And David's, I didn't read the whole chat yet, but Tucker Carlson he'll probably run for president in 2024. Stranger things have happened, huh? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Michael, in terms of containment of violence or protest, it seems to me the issue is that it's been kind of polarized where you can have that and you do have a certain security if you're a white conservative. So we've seen men who've wanted to murder Gretchen Whitmer. We have seen whites who have tried to, and successfully did, block a Biden bus going into Texas and forced it off the road. None of those people have faced any kind of serious prosecution. If they were black, they would be dead. So it does seem to me there's a kind of a privileging in our culture
Oh,
that
yeah, of
is
course.
so highly favorable of saying, look, if you're a white disgruntled Republican guy, go out there with your Glock or whatever, look at Kyle Rittenhouse, found innocent. My God.
You know the book, the Black Robes, White Justice.
I don't know, but
Okay, it's a very good book. It's right up your alley, what you're talking about. Yeah, by one of the, yeah, Bell is the author, professor of law. Yeah, black professor of law, of course. Yeah.
God, imagine if all the people who stormed the Capitol had been black.
totally, they'd be dead.
I mean, there you go. I mean, there would have been like an absolute massacre, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I spent 2 days near Syntagma Square. Every time I walk through it, I remember the snipers. I was walking through with a friend of people, Vic Chris and Josh Noel, and it was pointed out all the areas where the British snipers shot the communists arbitrarily in the square during the beginning of the Civil War. Right?
Uh,
They wanted to make sure. So, this goes to show you what blacks, Jews, gypsies, and communists all have in common. They're enemies of of the system, especially if you're a Bolshevik Jew, right? Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, this is very important. Yeah, of course, to remember. But again, it's how controlled it is. This is really the issue, right? Yeah. Yeah.
But it feels like what adds an additional level of capitalistic perversion to this all, we could say, is on the day of January 6th, you had someone like Sean Hannity, it's on tape, saying to Trump, why he's talking to him anyway is another question. This is not Antifa. These are your people. You really need to call us off. They are really going to kill Mike Pence. The following day, the guy is on Fox News saying it was Antifa. But it's still okay. It's licensed. No one has ever discussed seriously Sean Hannity being pushed out of here. Now, on the Democratic side, if we look at what happened with Chris Cuomo, which was far less, unethical in this, he did say things in favor of his brother, who was being, appropriately pushed out of the governorship because of a lot of inappropriate things he did. CNN fired him. Now, apparently, if we go a step further, at this point, Fox News is dropping Trump mostly because their advertising is beginning to pull out of this, and Rupert Murdoch doesn't want that. So it's like Trump mostly is reduced, and probably this will happen to DeSantis, to OAN, One American Network, which is, for whatever reasons, at least right now, not slavishly following what sponsors it has. Actually, they're being dumped by a number of different advertisers as well, but that they're able to make up the difference because, as I understand it, I could be wrong about this, they're just going to get an enormous amount of capital in independently of advertising, but like the Koch brothers, a gazillion other people like Betsy DeVos, uber billionaires who have the money, are going to just like pump them up to say, no.
Yeah, but David, to me, just as dangerous or even more dangerous is
Uh-huh.
the Pelosi's of the world who go to Taiwan and start playing this card. And, most people, I mean, I guess this group knows that her husband had semiconductor stock, right, that he sold
Right.
before her trip, especially Taiwan semiconductor and all this. And what's really going on there, but to sell arms, to make sure that the semiconductor industry can be reassured, et cetera, et cetera. And, just the phoniness of it, what's really the difference is really the point. So Trump is a clown, and, they have this white supremacist attitude. On the other hand, you have this kind of like, is Nancy Pelosi really out there for any kind of, black subjectivity? Come on, give me a break,
No, I know what you mean.
I mean, and I know because Gene Jeffries personally, I mean, I was there when he first started in politics and at the Lafayette Avenue, political club, progressive, was called PAPA, Progressive Political Association in Fort Greene. But I mean, he's become very, whitewashed. It's white now, more and more. He's becoming part of the crowd. So really the question is, we can see this, and yes, of course, minimally, they may produce a better bill. They're going to protect they'll try to protect abortion rights and all of that. But essentially, ultimately, does it really change the fundamentals, right? Either of them.
I think though
yeah,
that
yeah.
David was, I think, getting at sort of there was something else that I think is
All right,
interesting is that the white conservative male Republican does feel a certain kind of protective sheath around his actions, right? Because they're not held accountable, because they can do all these things. And it's interesting that, while of course there's money and, all these, things underneath what we see, that, it's like the far right has become the point of rebellion. The far right is the group, the sector that refuses to accept the legitimacy of the elections, right? As opposed to, and I think there's something to that. I think that there's something, about how they feel protected and held in a certain way, right?
But I mean, one has to put into that equation is the fear of change. I mean, I understand their rebelliousness against, many of the gains and how they operate, and going back and how seductive this can be to a group of people that say, what the hell happened to this country, et cetera, and going back to that. But the real problem here is that this is not a rebellion, in terms of anything that smacks of progression. It's completely nostalgic and completely regressive. I mean, David asked me about the 50s. Well, the 50s was a complete, thing. I mean, I grew up in New Orleans. You used to have colored and white, bathrooms, right? I grew up with this. I saw this, yeah. And in a sense. So what are we really going, what is going on here, in a sense? Yes, and they play to this kind of myth, cowboy myth of the Barnum and Bailey myth of the circus, etc. And this plays to an audience that could not accept changes, that is very uneducated, does not really think through anything, etc. And this is a very easy target audience that Murdoch has mastered, right? I mean, anybody in their right mind is not going to watch Fox News for news. You watch it to study it and how it's articulating things, but to watch it as a source and to believe anything on there, I mean, go back to school. It's like Roger. I don't know if you saw the interview with what's his name, the lead singer for Pink Floyd, Roger
Waters.
Yeah. Did you see that CNN interview? He took the side of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. I mean, in some ways, and it was kind of very interesting. He kept telling the reporter, who's obviously a friend of his, he told him, you got to go read. You got to go read. And this is what's been lost. There's this inability to read. This education stopped. It stopped. It came to a halt. It came to a halt in the 70s in a way. Yeah. In many ways, Yeah, it came to a halt in many ways. This is no longer going on. You can see it in the Hollywood production of movies. Measure the 70s against the 80s, just in terms of what came out of Hollywood. The beginning of the police procedural. Think about everything that was culturally produced. Not everything, of course, there were, elements of subversion in certain, I mean, you can go through and list them on probably one hand, subversive films that came out, or that the script writers got something in. But yeah, I mean, the cultural apparatus broke down completely as well. All of these things were coincide. And I'm not saying it was a conspiracy, but it did happen. And it was censored, and the Murdochs take over the Village Voice, right? This is very important to remember. And again, this whole thing that Chris was talking about, the internet highway, 1992 changed perception radically. Social media, the phone, right? In so many ways. Yeah, took it. Yeah, George. Yeah.
No, but 1970 and 1980 when Reagan came in. I'd go there, Michael, with a.
Well, I mean, yeah, he's part of the symptom. Yeah, I'm not saying he wasn't that, yeah, that's right. Well, they mentioned this, how Reagan was made by the General Electric Theater. Yeah.
Yes.
GE. European intellectuals are more aware of this than American intellectuals. This is the thing about a book like this. Once again, I point this out. They're the ones on top of what's happening here, not the ones interior, which is kind of interesting too. Yeah, in many ways. I mean, look at the movies of the 70s. It begins with 5 easy pieces. You have the Scorsese crowd. You have the whole, so many moments in that. The Vietnam films, Who Stopped the Rain, based on the novel Dog Soldiers. They don't make movies like this about wartime anymore. I mean, think about how great that movie was. One of Nick Nolte's greatest performances as a young man. Yeah, back in the day. Yeah.
I was El Norte.
Yeah. And, yeah. I mean, you had the liberal movie Coming Home, Jane Fonda. Just go back and read Letter to Jane by Jean-Luc Godard, right? But it was a bourgeois woman understand anything about the North Vietnamese struggle. It's a beautiful letter, by the way, as they made it into a film when she visited North Vietnam, right? How can she possibly understand this? And he's right, in a way, yeah, in so many ways. Yeah. But speaking about endo-colonization, here we lose a war. We lose the ground war completely. We lose, the United States has not really won a war since, and really in a way didn't win World War II. I mean, thanks to Battle of Stalingrad, we have to take that and put that in the equation. Maybe there was a joint victory if you want to be generous. But anyway, think about this. Have not won one war since then. Lost Korea, right? It was not a win situation, but it was a control situation, right? If you begin to think about it this way, think about, certainly Vietnam, Iraq, right? Afghanistan, now proxy war in the Ukraine. So, I mean, really, in a way, it's not a question of winning anymore. Yeah. It's a question of these hybrid wars that are necessary for this, what they're making, this relationship of new forms of capital accumulation. And of course, the social control that goes with this, in so many ways. So, yeah.
That's kind of an amusing thought that the only war we've ever won was the war we waged against ourselves, the Civil War.
It's true. It's true. When you really think about it. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Very, very much so. I don't know if you've ever read the book. It's again another kind of classic in what it does. And it's dated, but it's fundamentally it's very strong up until the 90s. Keers van der Peel's The Making of the Atlantic Ruling Class, and it has a very good chapter on the Wilson Offensive. Very, very good. It's out. It's in the new edition. It's a very, very significant book. Yeah, and still available. And I think still he understood rentier capitalism very well. So anyway, let's go on just a little bit. Assembly. So they're playing both on Hart and Negri here, as well as on the assemblage, right? Okay, thank you, Chris. We'll see you soon. Okay. Assembly is being played upon on the third volume, the fourth volume of the Hart Negri series, which Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, and then Assembly. And I understand there's a fifth one coming out, soon, even though Negri is not well by any means. So we'll see what results here. But anyway, montage of the Cold War. So the problems of the United States, and this is the next section, 237. Two problems: Russia abroad, labor at home, and again by Charles Wilson, who also announced, by the way, what is good for General Motors is good for the country, right? Same person that said that, right? Okay, a vice chairman of the War Production Board at the time, head of the War Department on Post-War Research and Office of Defense Mobilization. You know, these people, Blinken, Sullivan, that we all see on TV, these are just front people, obviously. You know, these are just to look without affect, to handle the media crowd, et cetera. They're terrible, et cetera. But, you know, we have many things. Okay, so yeah, page 22, Josh, in the section. Yeah.
No, just
Yeah,
there's a nice Heidegger quote that they quote from in the beginning of the book that was talking about more or less this idea of not winning a war because the idea of war and peace has been deformed basically into consumption. I just thought that was a nice line and sort of
Yes.
something to
Very
bring.
good. Yeah, section 17. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.
Inserted in 51 into his Overcoming Metaphysics. The overcoming in question was conceived, of course, during the Second World War. This passage by Heidegger defined exactly what the concepts war and peace became at the end of the two worlds. Changed into their deformation of essence, war and peace are taken up into erring, right? And disappear into the mere course of the escalating manufacture of what can be manufactured, because they become unrecognizable without regard to any distinction. Very good. The question of when and where there will be peace cannot be answered, not because the duration of war is unfathomable, but rather because the question already asks about something which no longer exists. Since war is no longer anything which could terminate in peace. War has become a distortion of the consumption of beings which is contained in peace. This long war and its length slowly eventuated, not in a peace of the traditional kind, but rather in a condition in which warlike characteristics are no longer as such at all, and peaceful characteristics have become meaningless and without content. This is very good. This is 1951, Heidegger, during the rehabilitation stage. You know, he's allowed. I think the denazification, you know, and his inability to teach was lifted that year. So, you know, this is maybe what he talked about. This passage was then later rewritten, and this is important. Again, I know we went through this early on in the semester, and A Thousand Plateaus, to indicate how technical scientific capitalization, and again, unless we see this as techno-scientific capitalization at work, to which we're all subjected to, you know, referring to what they call military industrial scientific university complex. Of course, you can enter pharmaceutical and some other things, and, you know, creates a new conception of security as materialized war, as organized insecurity, or molecularized, distributed, programmed catastrophe. And, you know, David, maybe for the people that are experiencing tinges of paranoia, you can tell them, well, you're getting into molecularized, distributed, programmed catastrophe. You're experiencing that, right? A new clinical term to be used from D&G. Yeah, okay, anyway. So this is very important. And thank you, Josh. This is a great, you know, again, the strategy of analogical reading, so you can go compare 10.2 to, you know, 17 in the introduction. Yeah, and this is to me, again, the really good writing, right? Very good writing, you know, in the sense that, you know, and reading by Josh, of course. Yeah.
My question about this section was more when he talks about, you know, this kind of war of new subjectivities,
right?
Sort of precondition for the Cold War. Is it sort of like is he sort of saying there like the sort of implementation of identity politics is sort of like was you know, central to sort of the manipulation of by these Cold War techniques of sort of negating for, you know, old formal terms of class.
Use of identity politics, because as we've learned recently, identity politics really came out of militant feminist practices, you know, in the beginning, and it did have a lot of force. But yeah, this manipulation and usage of identity politics and what it's become. Absolutely, I agree with that. Yeah.
So that was really like a Cold War implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the housewife as consumer, the commodified housewife, yeah, sin in the suburbs. You can go back and look at the period of that time of the sex in the suburbs, right? Where it came out of this, right, in a way, yeah, yeah. So anyway, this is very interesting too.
What page, Michael?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, George. Yeah.
What page?
Oh, I'm going back to 237. Josh referred us to the quote of Heidegger on page 22, which is in section 17 of the introduction.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to the second product, the New Deal for the world, etc., and the post-colonial transformation of the third world, less through military hardware. And this is very important, Carl. I mean, I want to emphasize again, because this is where they want to go. Less through military hardware and more through the dollar. Right? Yeah, yeah. It's, as we pointed out last week, the dollar is up 10% in relation to the euro, almost equivalent to the rate of inflation in the consumer price index right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Europe is for
Yeah.
sale this year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Put it that way. Yep. Right. This is what's going on.
Yeah,
Right?
the dollar along with the military is the basic anchor of U.S. power at this point, in my
Yes.
opinion.
Yes.
Those are the two pillars.
Yes. But less through military hardware and more through the dollar, because they want to make this move to new forms of financialization and its hegemony, right?
Mhm.
Yet can one be that disassociated from the other in the new forms of affirmation of American power and the managerial revolution that Orwell associated with the Cold War, to use the expression he forged in 1945? I don't know if you knew that was the term that Orwell, I did not know that Orwell used forged the term, created the term Cold War. But anyway, the argument goes as follows. It is likelier to put an end to large-scale wars at the cost of prolonging indefinitely a peace that is no peace, by robbing the exploited classes and peoples of all power to revolt. What we were talking about, this right to rebel, this power to revolt, has been completely suppressed, right? And at the same time, putting the possessors of the bomb on a basis of military equality. Very interesting. There's a double internal external dissuasion of which the articulation commands the Cold War as a new global mode of managing the constitutive conflict of the period. The Cold War is not coextensive to it, it is constitutive of the globalization of civil war, tended to take its autonomy since the exploited classes and the people from whom they wanted to take all the power revolted throughout the world, and its management in an unprecedented form of military security produced by a tacit agreement never to use the atomic bomb against one another, right? This ecologistical understanding that controlled the rise to extremes, where the extremity is no longer a limit in the Clausewitzian political sense, but the definition of an imperial and planetary playground, where the tendency is towards duels and the invention of a new type of government of populations. This is Orwell, speaking. The clairvoyance of the analysis, and there's something very Orwellian in Virilio, and Virilio wrote on speed and politics in this as well, on the atom, could almost make us forget that the first assumed atomic bomb, A bomb, was tested in 49, 4 years after the publication of Orwell's article, and 2 years after the Truman Doctrine of containment ended up imposing the expression Cold War. Interesting. This contributed to relativizing the imminence and the reality of the Soviet danger. To put it quickly, Stalin had no doubt about American economic military hegemony. He understood the message of Hiroshima and adopted a defensive position after the war, at least according to the language used by Truman in his speech to Congress in 47. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. The disconnect, armed minorities or by outside pressure, direct or indirect aggression, plays the role of a real inclusive synthesis, right? It does not close on these terms. It announces and states the unlimited character of the Cold War strategy as the principle of transformation and reproduction of the enemy by totalizing and totalitarian transference. Very important. This is the thesis of communism as the new fascism. And they're interesting here the way they use, somewhere rent in some ways here. This is kind of implicit in this. Totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. Hot Hitler and cold Stalin. Yeah, and that's a new jazz band. Huh? Hot Hitler and cold Stalin. Huh? We could work with that in terms of abstractions, right? The Mel Brooks could work with that. He's still alive, so yeah, that'd be good. Okay, in a series of articles, and I think we read this before. I think we went here. Lippmann, wanted to give another meaning to the policy of containment. And this goes to show you that you have the Washington Doctrine articulated by the cult of experts and the researchers, and then Lippmann, who is a policy wonk, right? And someone who's in tremendous power as a journalist. He started with surprise at the exclusive reference to communist revolution and Marxist ideology, right? To explain the supposedly expansionist behavior of the Soviet government in the post-war period, even as respected the spirit of the Yalta Agreement based on the positions of the Red Army and the importance of its contribution to the defeat of Germany and Japan. It was the mighty power of the Red Army, not the ideology of Karl Marx. This is Lippmann speaking, which enabled the Russian government to expand its frontiers. Right? It's interesting. It's not the work of Das Kapital, right? It's not the work of State and Revolution of Lenin, right, that are producing this, right? But the Red Army that did this. And this, he observes, was in a sense essentially limited to restoring the sphere of czarist influence and to compensation for the terrestrial losses of 1917 and 1921. And in some ways, you can think of Putin in this regard too. This whole reference back to Peter the Great, right? Yeah. Instead of MAGA, Putin has, Mara, make Russia great again, right? Yeah. Anyway, the USSR behaved like any other major continental power would, while the USA developed such an unorthodox strategy, a strategic monstrosity, that the diplomatic channels leading to a pax vera seemed undetermined in advance. The solution proposed by the famous publicist, Lippmann, to return to a more classical balance of power, redirecting the logic and rhetoric of American power in the sense of a retreat of all non-European armed forces outside Europe to ensure respect of Stalin's commitment to not integrate Eastern countries to the USSR. In short, what Lippmann advances of the breaking out of the American Cold War strategy is the only problem taken into consideration is Russia abroad, especially with the dissolution of the Comintern. And this is important too. I mean, really important to think through. The dissolution of the Comintern, the Communist International in 43, the dissolution of the American Communist Party in 44. After the members of the CPUSA moved from pro-strike positions to anti-strike positions to support the war effort. Interesting. Stalin's pressure on the Greek and the Yugoslavian communists, and this goes on in Greek debates all the time, within the communist, what's called the Interior Communist Party, to preserve monarchy and the protests of English communists against the dissolution of the coalition government immediately after the war. No one could doubt that Stalin had, according to Hobsbawm, a definitive goodbye to world revolution. And this is something they want to recapture, that they see happening, right? I mean, this is where they mark, not that Stalin was brutal in the gulags and all of this, but really in a sense, what he was ultimately was very integral to the plan of the long goodbye to world revolution. This is really what happened there, right? Yeah, in many ways. Yeah. So this is interesting. It's a very different kind of thesis and needs, exploration. Despite the shared warmongering rhetoric and the apocalyptic tone adopted by the U.S. alone, the first characteristics of the Cold War, as the British historian Hobsbawm notes, was paradoxically defined by the objective absence of an imminent danger of world war and the speed of the mutual recognition of a certain balance of power. We talked about balance of terror, right? According more or less to the lines of demarcation of 1943 through 45. Starting in 51, the date in which Truman relieved General MacArthur of his functions after the general, at the risk of resorting to the use of nuclear weapons, expressed the wish to extend the Korean War into Chinese territory, which had become the People's Republic of China in 49, to the 1970s, including the repression of the workers' insurrection in East Berlin in 53, the year when the USSR acquired the hydrogen bomb, 9 months after the Americans and then the Hungarian 56 and Czechoslovakian 68 revolts, both defeated by Soviet tanks. The Cold War between the two superpowers increasingly took on the aspect of a cold peace. This is interesting, right? I mean, in a sense, right? Sustained by the relative balance of nuclear terror over population forced to choose sides, two world camps, bipolarism, Putin calls for multipolarity, of which one of the best exponents of is, in a way, written exponents is certainly, Ben Norton on his multipolarista, programs, and of course, Pepe Escobar, who's on top of this very well. One will think here of the Soviet prohibitions against Titoism, right? In Yugoslavia, of course, and of the reciprocal advantages taken from all types of repression of grassroots democracy in Eastern countries, right? Interesting. But also the strategy of the Cold War as a means of imposing American hegemony on his allies through the angle of reorganizing the world economy towards a globalization that could no longer be satisfied with restoring the classic political military forms of the balance of power. After the failure of the ghost policy, right, according to which the Soviet Union would fall if strategically surrounded, the race for the most high-tech armaments, H-bomb, SAC, etc., was oriented towards a strategy of massive retaliation. And this was the thing, why you get a film like Dr. Strangelove, if you will, the arms race, etc., the doomsday machine, 53 to 60. Supposed to eliminate the possibility of a limited attack with conventional means, it was particularly aimed at limiting the risks involved in the American neo-colonial military expeditions in the hottest zones of the First Cold War. It is not sound military strategy permanently to commit U.S. land forces to Asia to a degree that leads us no strategic reserve. Change was imperative to assure that the stamina needed for permanent security, right? But it was equally imperative that change should be accomplished by understanding of our true purposes. Soviet re-territorialization and American deterritorialization. Very, very interesting the way they frame this. The American administration claimed here to decide permanently between its nationalistic interests and components, in other words, strictly geopolitical, turned towards Asia, and its global internationalist ambitions directed towards Europe, to base the logic of the Cold War on an exclusively strategic basis. Although the American administration was incapable of keeping up with this choice, the direction was given. It was left to great power management to take charge of the geopolitics of the new imperialism. So in this passage from Defense, on which the original doctrine of containment would still be based, to permanent security, we reach the change in paradigm found within the Cold War peace, the indefinite protagation prolongation of a peace that is not peace due to the strategic threat of a war so ontologically absolute, total destruction, universal death for all civilian populations, that the economy of permanent war that it promotes is a synonym in the West, the playmaker, of the work of reprogramming social life as a whole. Very interesting. When Paul Virilio called endo-colonization, and this is a term we began with, right? Come back full circle, that should be associated with the obsession with the question of control in a historical sequence when American capitalist supremacy is less threatened abroad by the risk of a globalization of the Soviet threat than at home, at the heart of the international system of capital, where the explosion of labor struggles and racial wars was kindled by the tumultuous demobilization in the fall of 45. So the two beautifully done, this two enemies, the Russia on the one hand, and on the other hand, the strife at home, labor at home. And very interesting. And again, I really recommend, and we'll go to Cold War Detroit too tonight. I really recommend the new Men of Labor by C. Wright Mills. It's an easy read, but his thesis is that labor had the upper hand, at that moment, and did not fulfill the leaders' the ambitions, and that Reuther ultimately could have been that figure, but ended up being I think murdered later for standing up to the through the UAW, but it was too late at that point. Okay, so Cold War Detroit, and this becomes interesting here because this is how the propaganda began against labor at home. The war was really at home, and we didn't realize it. Going back to David to the 50s, we all thought when you grow up during this period, the metaphors were the Iron Curtain, right? And of course, I used to ask, why are they so smart there in mathematics if there's an Iron Curtain? I used to get in trouble at school, and anyway, I tried to learn. I was the only student that would take Russian at my school. I ended up, 4 people joined. I was the last student that wanted to stay there. I said, I really want to learn this language. I was impressed by the level of mathematics and all of this. But, when you really think about this externalization, this projection of the enemy on the outside, right? When the enemy really is going on at home much more viciously and strategically than it is abroad. For all of the absurd, we know what went on in Guatemala. We know, the reactions to Cuba. We know all these things, what happened in terms of, puppet governments around the world. But the war at home was amazing, how this was happening on an everyday level, especially against the working class and labor, and how this became compromised. And then how we talked about this last week, from 1973 to today, labor has not moved 1 inch in terms of real wages, not 1 inch in 52 years, not 1 inch. The only way they created is to give credit cards, right? And a little bit of benefits.
Or anyone else, just a question before we jump into this section. I need to get off in a few minutes.
Okay, yeah, well, we can pick it up next week. Yeah.
Like the story with Luther, I mean, that I know that like in the, during the war, he was actually proposing, and I think immediately after the war, sort of like joint management of, the economy by, this, that labor would have official recognition both in national planning and at the firm level and the plant level. And then there's, the big shift that happens under Truman in 49, where essentially the AFL-CIO capitulates to, essentially the Cold War and the agreement to kind of purge or suppress communist influence within the ranks. But I don't, did Reuther, like, I thought he actively signed on to that agenda.
He did, but then he turned against that later.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
and then he went, very, very, very much to bat for his rank and file in terms of economic, arrangements, wages and benefits. Yeah. Didn't turn completely to say we support the commies in the union.
Yeah,
We
and
support, you know, I mean, this didn't happen. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think they also tried to create certain coalition, like labor community coalitions, with some of the militant black organizations.
That's right. The next section about Detroit is really about the racism in the unions. I'll go you know, to maybe some of the crucial points. It's getting late and some people have to leave. I want to go to, first of all, the objection about the New Deal, right? This is page 247. Congress, and Origi wrote, Congress and the American business community were too far rational in their calculations of the pecuniary costs and benefits of U.S. foreign policy to release the means necessary to carry out such an unrealistic plan. The transformation of global civil war into global war for the security brought domestic policy to the war of class, race, and sex. Right. So anyway, the first objection was raised by the summoned Democratic senators of the Black Belt, who were both the best administrators of segregationist laws, Jim Crow laws, and Roosevelt's supporters in Congress. It could be resumed by the single question kindled by the increase in racist racial riots in more than 45 American cities, including Detroit, where Roosevelt had to send troops. In 1943 alone, and by their return in the immediate post-World War period, did Black Southerners and Africans deserve freedom from fear? Published in 1944-45, the book Interventions of Du Bois, Color and Democracy, Walter White, A Rising Wind, and Rayford W. Logan, What the Negro Wants, did not hesitate to emphasize the international aspect of racial inequality as both imperialist and colonialist, to show that the question of domestic foreign policy that is contained was far from exclusively being Southern, right? Very important. It implied the dual delegitimization of the racial construction of American identity and European colonial powers. As an unfortunate confirmation of the African-American argument, the Charter of the UN combined the principle of non-discrimination voted on by a divided American delegation with respect for national sovereignty, which prohibited the condemnation of colonialism as such and reserved the application of international law and the federal jurisdiction to American domestic policies in the hands of states. Again, according to the facts, racial segregation did not need Southern laws to be practiced throughout the country, in particular in terms of employment and housing, which had been the issue for unionized Black workers during the war. Inversely, Jim Crow caused the failure of the Dixie operation launched in 46 by the CIO, right, to spread the Union victories of the North to the textile industries in the South, J.B. Stevens, right? The reality of the free world struggle against communist slavery, freedom versus slavery, in Truman's speech. And of course, this was Hayek revisited. You know, Chris has lost us, our Hayek expert, right? The mask of Hayek, we can call him. Yeah, anyway, so the accents of propaganda here in the context of a situation known by all, where the Iron Curtain was applied to a nation divided north to south by the color line, right? The final report of the president of the Committee on Civil Rights, submitted in October 47, based its argument on the fact that negligence in terms of civil rights was a serious obstacle to American leadership in the world. Taking up Truman, American supremacy over a world on an accelerated path to decolonization, Asia openly presided at home over redefining the race war as the last imperfections to correct. And again, you know, I was still an pre-adolescence during this period, but I remember some of this rhetoric. In the democracy of capital, in order not to give weapons to the communist adversary by weakening the moral position of the United States. Interesting, huh? The imperfections that need to be addressed in the system. How many times have we heard this, right? And what did Churchill said? We're not going to be the best system, but we're the best of the worst, right? Right, in a sense, always using this kind of argument. Yet, whatever the cost, and at the risk of destabilizing the principle of a liberal and anti-communist defense of civil rights, an argument borrowed by many leaders, and they got co-opted this way in the Afro-American movement, the East-West axis has to integrate the North-South axis of the European colonial powers and their satellites that were increasingly closing in on Africa, right? There was increasing fear of premature independence. I like this, premature independence, right? Think of these terms that they use, premature independence, the presumptuousness, this arrogance that is speaking, especially since American economic interests were increasingly involved. Among other merits, the Korean War allowed an end to the timid and strategic racial reformism of the American administration after it prohibited discrimination in the armed forces, July 1948. Yeah, I think his name is Nelson Perry, communist who wrote about this, his experience in the armed forces as a black man during that period, which had to be remobilized in the names of ideals of freedom of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the most American sense of the world, it was the liberal representation of subcellis. It was contemporary to the anti-communist turn of the majority of the trade union world, right? And the abandoning of its civil and internationalist agenda in favor of an adhesion to the Marshall Plan. Here's your Ruther at work too, Carl. I mean, the adhesion to the Marshall Plan, which was really going on forever. And, this is the stuff that, the wine gardens and the, and the new AFL-CIO people trump, right? And, all the times. They're always trumpeting this out, right? In a sense, right? One of the reasons they're so pro-Ukraine, where's the next economic boom going to come from? Lend lease to Ukraine, yeah, yeah. Okay. So, okay. So in the South in particular, 1 year after endorsing the Marshall Plan, the CIO took it upon itself to rein in the most radical union branches with the help of elements close to the KKK, right? Very interesting how the unions then had these associations. So this is what, relayed by constant communications to model global procession of the Rachel Glenn, the Voice of America, the Program of Cultural Affairs, psychological warfare, and propaganda, bipolar representation was only interrupted by the growing power and radicalness of the civil rights movement. And then he goes through all these things. The new anti-colonialist wave, Ghana, Algeria, Congo, Castro allied with Malcolm X and all of this. We all know this stuff going forward. But then the great theme of Stokely Carmichael, and he was important, forgotten, internal colonization, thought by Fanon, right? Curiously, never quite quoted by Foucault, how this worked in this, quote, temporal sequesterization, how this internal colonization and turning it towards Black power. So entirely for the baby boom generation, and particularly the student moment, the question of internal colonization was the major instrument of rehistoricization and repoliticization of racism, other than its management in terms of the police was only taken into consideration by the system in the margins of the analysis of individual competencies of human capital before being submitted to a purely economist approach in terms of cost and benefits. And you have the Chicago school of thinking that tried to think of the Civil War in terms of cost benefits, that slavery, they actually measured this through cost benefits and did a quantitative analysis.
Michael, just to make one passing comment, about like the paragraph before is,
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of, I think Mike Davis has argued this, that the failure to organize the South was basically the Achilles heel of American labor, because when capital, started to flee, that's where they initially went,
Yeah,
that they, and
absolutely.
today we see the results, right? Like that would have been I mean, maybe it wouldn't have worked, but the abandonment of that project was decisive for American our trajectory.
Well, the racism in the unions is something that's been swept under the rug for a very long time, and we know about it, but it's never really brought up anymore, in actual union talk, and really killed the union, as you say, the movement. I mean, the textile industry, the sugar industry, refineries, the oil industry, all of these things that had many, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so let me, I know people want to go, so why don't we begin next time with, we'll move forward this just a little bit, the underside of the American way of life, and then we'll go on to the relationship, Deleuze and Marx and Clausewitz in '68, the event itself, and we'll pick up with that next week. Start with Marx, May '68, and Clausewitz, right? The end of the Clausewitzian theory of war, what May of '68 did, and then we'll go into this 3Ds that they talk about as well. And there's a very good book called Dead Cities that I recommend that they cite, an art book by Jean-Christophe Bély about the photographs of urban warfare, taken on by the French army. So I'm very much interested in this logistic. One of the reasons I like Foucault is because of security, population, and territory. His early work in these seminars at the Collège de France, very important in terms of strategies of police in Paris during the post '68, how you were going to contain this ideational revolution that was still very active out there, and then we can talk about that too. So, okay. So, I'll let you all go. I know it's, getting on dinner time for some, lunch for others. And so, thanks. And be well and see